Hi, and welcome to my 2022 book wrap-up video. This is basically where I'm gonna go over everything I read last year and give you my quick thoughts and feelings on them, and also give a very loose ranking to all of them. I was able to read 36 books last year, which I'm really proud of. 3 a month, which was my goal, and hopefully in 2023 I'll be able to continue that. The way that it's gonna work, I'm gonna start off with the books I read at the beginning of the year and go to the end. It's not gonna be best to worst or worst to best. The only thing that I'm gonna specify is that once I hit a series, I'll talk about the series as a whole, instead of having to skip around throughout the whole year. This video is probably gonna be really long, so let's jump into it. At number 1, I've got No Country for Old Men, written by Cormac McCarthy. This is a book that was turned into a movie, obviously, and I really love the movie. The movie's probably one of the best films I've ever seen, and this book kind of just helps you expand the thoughts and ideas that the movie was trying to show. There are some things in the book that aren't in the movie, but I don't think that would have made the movie much better, but it is nice to read about it here. It has a very unique way of explaining dialogue, and it really does show more of the themes that maybe the movie was supposed to cover, especially with the sheriff, but nothing crazy mind-blowing or anything that hit me personally. But I did enjoy it. I don't have anything negative to say about it, so I would put it in the recommended pile. At number 2, I've got Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights. Obviously, I did not read this book physically. I got the audiobook because I wanted that Matthew McConaughey voice ringing in my ears. This is definitely one of the most fun books I've read all year. It's really fast-paced. Matthew McConaughey's got a lot of interesting stories. He really jumps throughout his life. This is not like a year-by-year detailed of everything that happens in his life. I really love his time he spent in Australia, and really interesting to see how he got into acting and how he started to learn all that stuff. Really like how he paces out story and his personal worldview. I think the audiobook was around 6 hours, so it was a quick one. I most likely will be reading it again. I highly recommend it. And then at number 3, I've got the whole Game of Thrones series. I started off the first book somewhere in January, and then I ended the year with A Dance of Dragons, the 5th book in the series. And of course, I started off by watching the show just like most people, and I always vowed that one day I would read the books, but after season 8, and you know what happened in season 8.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer every night.
I kind of pushed myself away from Game of Thrones for a little bit because I couldn't suffer that terrible ending. But now, after a couple of years and the fact that they were coming out with a new show this year, I started reading the books. And I gotta say, everything that I loved about the show the first couple of seasons is 100 times fold in the books. There's a lot more characters, there's a lot more world building, there's a lot more families, a lot more houses, a lot more connections, a lot of different kind of ways of viewing the world. That's really interesting, a lot of in-depth stuff. And I will say, some of the characters I was rooting for in the show, like Ned Stark, really start to play out more differently in the books. Like in the show, he's kind of like this fantastical, very basic good guy, and you think he's going to win, and you're rooting for him because he's the good guy. But in the book, he kind of gets caught up in a political drama, and he seems a lot more foolish because he's playing more of a tropey kind of character in the show, and it comes off in the books as more idiotic. Where a character like Stannis in the show, I pretty much hated. I did not like anything that he did. But in the books, I like him a lot more. I feel like they give him more depth in here. He's definitely one of my more favorite characters in the books compared to the show. Anyway, I could talk about these books. I could talk about the show and what I like and don't like about the either ones.
What?
I can't really rank the books on the scale individually. I'm gonna put all of them in my favorites pile altogether so it doesn't get too clogged up. But I will say the third one is my favorite, followed by the first, second, fifth, and fourth. The fourth one's only at the bottom because that's where George R.R. Martin started splitting the point of view characters, and at first it was really jarring. Maybe on second read, if I ever do read it again, it won't be as jarring. At number 4, we've got another big series. I've got Dune on the list. I obviously watched the movie, and it was really good, and it actually got me to read the books. I was really interested in seeing how Paul's character would play out, and I didn't just want to spoil myself on the internet or have to wait until the second part came out. So I picked up the book. The thoughts and ideas here explored with like religion, government, groupthink, history, and psychology across the whole series is way, way, way interesting.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Than I thought it would ever be. The third and fourth book go way off the rails, way more than the first one. And I definitely am enjoying this series. I definitely fell in love with this series. I'm reading Heretics of Dune right now. Dune is definitely the most accessible one. It's basically the hero's journey with a little bit of a twist. Dune Messiah feels more like an epilogue than its own book. But the third and fourth one really shows what Frank Herbert was trying to do. I think he did something highly unique, something I don't think anyone will ever be able to recreate. So I would put Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune in my favorites, while I would put Dune in just my highly recommended. Dune Messiah, the little orphan child, I would put somewhere in the average rating. Also, throughout this video, you'll see I'll have some of the books physically here and some of them I don't. Some of them I'm not sure if I'm gonna buy physically yet, and some of them I'm really worried about getting specific cover art. I like a specific way of showing it. I usually don't like it when the movie or the TV show's on the cover. This one I got for free, so I couldn't get away from it. At number 5, I've got Orwell's Animal Farm. Now this book, I didn't read it for the pleasure or because people recommended it to me, but because so much when you're watching videos online where people talk about government and technology, they bring up Animal Farm and 1984, which I read last year. And I just want to make sure that when people are referencing these books that they're being accurate with it. I can never tell. But the book itself, it's obviously a classic, and I really like the dark fantasy kind of, or not dark fantasy, the dark fairy tale style he's going here. It feels like something you would read for a child, but then the subtext underneath is really heavy-handed. I wouldn't say I recommend this for the fact that it was fun or anything like that. I wouldn't want to put it in the classics, or if you feel the need to, because this story is more about the message than it is about your personal enjoyment of it. At number 6, I've got another sci-fi series called The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. He is a Chinese writer, and it does come across in these books. Obviously, the characters are all Chinese, and a lot of the settings are Chinese. And some people I've seen online even say that his writing style is very Eastern, because a lot of the characters are kind of pushed off to the side for the ideas, that the scientific ideas that they're trying to push here. So it's very concept heavy, which I've really enjoyed. I've really loved some of the ideas, and each book really covers a different kind of section of it. The Three-Body Problem, the first one in the series, really covers like First Contact. The Dark Forest covers like relations with each other, and then Death's End really just shows how civilization keeps growing. I really love this series. I will say The Dark Forest was definitely one of my favorite reads, and I would highly recommend The Three-Body Problem. Death's End, the third one, not my favorite, but there's some things at the end that kind of irritated me, but it did get an emotional reaction for me, which maybe that's what the author was trying to do. But I would put that one in just the average pile. At number 7, I've got The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. This book, when I first saw it, I was very hesitant to even look at it because the title just seemed very lazy and lame to me. And I was worried it was going to be one of those books where this guy's just talking about, oh, get money, become rich, and you'll be happy, and women will love you. You know, that's what I was expecting to get out of this kind of book. I thought it was just going to be one of those hustler books. But I picked it up at Barnes & Noble's just to read real quick while I was in the store. And I've heard the first part, and I gotta say, the title is a trick. It's bait to get you to read the book, because throughout the book, Manson, the author, talks about things you do have to care about. So he did get me with that title.
Gotcha.
I think some of the ideas he does cover here are really good. Really fundamental psychology and philosophy books. I'm not some kind of philosophy major, but I have read some stuff, and I did take a psychology class in college. So I feel like a lot of those ideas that I felt like I was struggling when I was reading those books, he's actually able to bring them in and bring them to a modern audience, which I really appreciate. I would recommend this to anyone that needs maybe a little bit of a reality check. It's a very quick read and a very good book. I put this in my recommended. At number 8, I've got Life of Pi. Now this book, obviously I read it because of the movie as well, but unlike the other stuff that I was talking about, I think I like the book better here, simply because it really more focuses on Pi and his relation with his religions. He starts off as a Hindu, but then he meets a Christian and a Muslim, and they affect his worldview. And I really love when he gets on the boat, how these 3 religions play off of his need for survival, how he relates his spirituality to the world around him, and how these 3 different religions show him different aspects of it. I will say this book, unlike the movie, has this sweet kind of tenderness while it's got this brutality. Obviously, the movie's not going to show this kid getting bruises and bed sores and starving, but in the book, it covers a lot more of that. It gets a little bit more graphic, but I still really enjoyed it. It definitely had an emotional reaction for me, and I like the initial theme of the story, that sometimes telling a fake story can be more impactful than just telling the events as they happened realistically. I like this one. I would put this in highly recommended. At number 9, I've got the sci-fi classic series, The Foundation. I was able to read the first trilogy and one of the sequels, Foundation's Edge, and I really enjoyed this series. It does have its ups and downs. The first book, for example, I feel is more of like a collection of stories that don't really tie into each other except for the initial plot device, which is the Selden plan. But once you get out of the first book and you move into Foundation and Empire and Second Foundation, the story really starts to expand itself, and I really enjoyed it a little bit more. There are parts of it that are a little bit dated because he does focus a lot on nuclear technology. It's so funny having people have like nuclear reactors on their belt and stuff like that. Films that like you're able to fold 1,000,000 times because they didn't have the idea of computers yet. Foundation's Edge, the sequel to the trilogy, is by far the best, I would say, so far at least, because basically it takes everything that the first 3 books are talking about, takes it up another notch, and introduces a whole new faction, which really expands the universe. So I think this one I would put in highly recommend. The first one I would put into the classic section. I think that's where it belongs. And the other 2, I'd put somewhere in between with average and recommend. At number 10, I've got 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now, obviously, the movie by Kubrick, one of the best movies ever made. If you ever go online and you look up top 10 movies or top 100 movies, 2001 A Space Odyssey will always be on there. I didn't know that Kubrick and Clarke were writing this story together at the same time, and then they both released it in their respective field. And I think that really gives a good pairing for the movie and the book here, because while I was reading it, I couldn't get those images out of my mind of the movie, and I rewatched it after I finished reading. And while I was reading, or after I was watching the movie, I was thinking about the things that happened in this book, and I wanted to reread the book just because they fit together so nicely. It's almost like 2 puzzle pieces. Highly recommend the book. It really goes well with the movie, and I had a really good time with this one. And for number 11, I've got Space Prison. Now this one's a little bit weird. I feel like this is definitely the most underground book. The only reason why I read it is because a YouTuber that reviews sci-fi books said he was gonna read it. So I read it just to see if our thoughts kind of went together. This book basically covers a bunch of people that get stranded on a planet that basically wants to kill them. It's a very simple survival story, and it gets really brutal at some points in the book. You know, it becomes really violent, but you're just so invested into this survival aspect. I feel like humans trying to beat the odds is just it's got such a human spirit to it that you keep going. It was a very enjoyable read, a very easy read. I was finding myself really just turning the pages on this one. You know, it's nothing crazy. It's not gonna blow your mind or introduce you to anything new, but it is a lot of fun. So I'd put this in my recommended pile. And then at number 12, I've got the Mistborn series. The first one used to be called The Final Empire, and now it's just called Mistborn. And I will say this is the first series or a fantasy series outside of Game of Thrones that I started reading, and I was worried that it was gonna fall into a lot of tropes, you know, like pointless love triangles, main character that has unlimited power, or artifacts or items in the books, you know, doing whatever the writer needed it to do at the time, or really cliche villains. But none of that is in this book. I love how this book is very much, it's somehow a coming of age story, a heist film, a medieval epic, and then it's also a story about revolution. And then the other ones cover even more interesting things, and it all works very well together, and it's tied with this amazing magic system, really balanced out between the characters, and it shows growth as well. You can be more proficient at it. Besides those compliments, I would say this whole series is highly accessible. I feel like I can give this book series to anybody that can pick it up, they'll read it, they'll understand it, and they'll most likely enjoy it as well. The first one is definitely the best because I don't think Brandon Sanderson at first was planning on writing any sequels. He even stresses how difficult it was to start the second one, the Well of Ascension. First one's definitely the best. I would put it in highly recommended. Or no, I would put it in one of my favorites for the year. And then I would put both of the other ones into highly recommended. It's still a very good series. The Well of Ascension and The Age of Heroes are still very good books. And I like how the series ended. And I will most likely be reading more Brandon Sanderson. At number 13, I've got Hyperion by Dan Simmons. It's another sci-fi book, and you'll notice I did read a lot of sci-fi this year, mainly because I found myself engrossed in this genre, just how different and varied a lot of the ideas can be and how different the characters can be. I really love it, and this book is by far the best single book that I read in the sci-fi genre. I've really enjoyed it. It does have some sequels, and I will be reading those, but regardless of what happens in those other books, this book itself is probably going to be one of my favorites of all time. I really love all the characters in it, and I love how different their world views are, their beliefs, their lives, their religious views. I really love everything that this book covers. The first story that covers with this Catholic guy, super interesting, and I was really worried that I loved the first story so much that I wouldn't enjoy the other ones, but the other ones are even or probably some of them are even better, but it's funny how some of them are more funny, more serious, more violent, more action paced, and some of them are more dark and mysterious. Some of them are a little bit more homey, I would say. I really love this series. I love all these stories in this single book. I cover so much. It's really hard for me to put it down. The only reason why I haven't bought it is because I do want to get a really nice cover with it. I don't like the one in Barnes & Nobles where it's just a bunch of squigglies. But yes, definitely one of my favorites of the year. At number 14, we've got a whole different tonal shift. Now we've got The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. This is a religious book. That's why I say it's a little bit tonally different. And it's definitely made for religious people, but I think anybody could read this, pick it up. It's a short read and get something out of it when it comes to morality and how we view ourselves as individuals, especially in Western civilization. The story is quite literally an older demon sending letters to a younger demon on how to corrupt a man and get him to turn away from God. It's, like I said, it's a short read, but I found myself putting it down constantly because I was absorbing what he was trying to tell me. There was a lot of self-reflection in this book, points out how selfish we are with our time and energy. I really like this book. I want to read more of C.S. Lewis. Like I said, anybody could read this book, but I would really highly recommend it for anyone that's a Christian. One of my favorites of the year. At number 15, I've got Milk and Honey, which is a poetry book. And unlike a lot of the books I've recently mentioned, I hate this book. This is probably the worst book I've read all year. It was so bad that I was debating on whether even putting it into the video or on my list because I just did not enjoy it. Mainly because I think a lot of the ideas in here are not only very selfish, but I also feel like some of the ideas here are dangerous. I know that's a dangerous thing to say about a book, but I just don't think these things that this author, obviously I didn't even live their life, I don't know them personally, but some of the ideas they put out here, I feel like they're trying to intend with good intentions to help people, but I feel like some of them will do more harm than good. Of course, it's a very short read, it's a poetry book, so if you want, you can check it out, read it for yourself. I wouldn't buy it. I would find it in a library or go to Barnes & Noble and pick it up real quick to see if you enjoy it. But I did not enjoy this one at all. This one is definitely going in the no good pile. It's going to be there alone. The only book I did not like this year. At number 16, I've got a nonfiction book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. This book covers how college campuses have changed over the last couple of years and how we as a society have also changed from having different moral viewpoints that the author thinks have become a lot more self-destructive. Jonathan Haidt, I've seen him on YouTube before. I've watched his video about anti-fragility in children, and I think he's a very good educator, and this book, even though he does say he's left-leaning, very comes off as middle of the ground, which is what you want from someone that's highly educated. You want them to have as least biased view as possible. Colleges have basically become highly expensive daycares for adult children, and how it's no longer about learning or expanding your mind, but just saying the same things you already believe, and how these ideas are starting to leak out into the public. And he tries to give solutions on how to solve those problems. I feel like this book and Excellent Sheep, which he actually references in the book, is a good pairing for anyone that's going into a modern day college or anyone interested in a modern day culture on the college campuses. I will put this in my recommended pile. At number 17, I've got Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. I will say this is not my first time reading this book, and I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peterson. I've watched a lot of his videos on YouTube, especially his biblical series. So this is a very biased review, but I feel like Jordan Peterson does give something to a lot of young men in the Western culture that we're lacking, which is a good role model. I feel like a lot of new male role models are very selfish. They focus on just getting money or objects or sleeping with a lot of women. Where I feel like Jordan Peterson really is trying to push the idea of personal responsibility, finding your own meaning and purpose, taking on some kind of meaningful task, and being a generally good person, which I don't see these other role models showing up and doing. And in this book, you do get his care coming through, even though it's highly scientific. Some of these rules in here seem very simple and very obvious when you're just reading them across. But really where it comes into depth for me is when he really gets into the reasoning behind them. He is a psychologist, so he brings up a lot of data, a lot of research that he's gone through, other books that he's read, and he gives much more of a concrete basis on why he thinks these are important. And I think these are some really good tools for people that are seeking some kind of help in life. It definitely does feel like an antidote to chaos. This is clearly one of my favorites. It's going right to the top. At number 18, I've got Will by Will Smith. What a great title. This one is definitely one of the most insightful books I've read. This is, or at least the first 2/3 are. I had no idea that Will Smith was so influential in the rap game, especially at the beginning. The first third of the book really covers his childhood upbringing and his rap career. Which was all new to me, very interesting, a history I never really heard about. And then, of course, my favorite part was when he transferred into his movie making, him becoming an actor, him being on Bel Air. Mainly because as he's reciting and kind of becoming nostalgic for these things, you can tell a little bit. I'm also, becoming nostalgic for it because when these movies were coming out, I was a child. So a lot of his classic old films are personal to me. So that was probably my favorite part of the book, is that section. Where it starts to lose me is a little bit more towards the last third, I would say, because it's heavily focused on his wife, Jada. And I don't like his wife. I don't like Jada. Obviously, I don't know her personally. I don't know her life. But this book made me like her less. It makes her, I feel, look worse. It's funny because Will Smith tries to cover it up. He tries to give justifications for it, and I feel like it just makes it even worse. And this is even before she cheated on him or the whole slapping thing. And then the last third of the book, I will also say, it starts to lose its emotional ground because it's basically Will Smith realizing that money won't make you happy, which I feel is something that most people know. But I guess someone that hasn't been told that or ever heard about that, maybe it will be insightful. Maybe that's just a personal gripe. But mainly, I don't like the last third of the book because of Jada. If you don't like Will Smith, if you don't like who he is, I wouldn't read this book. So I will put this one in the conditions pile simply because I feel like it's a very specific audience. At number 19, I've got The Clan of the Cave Bear. My mom gave me the 4th book in the series. She just gives me random books, so I went back and I got the first one. And the premise of this book is basically a descendant of modern humans living with Neanderthals, which is a super interesting premise, and it does deliver on it multiple times. The morality and the brutality of a prehistoric world is really interesting, and also to see just how rigid the culture and traditions of a Neanderthal clan would be. Obviously, this is a fictional story. I don't know how accurate it can be, scientifically at least, but the ideas in here are really interesting. The only thing I will say that this book could probably lose 50 to 100 pages and still be just as good. The author spends way too much time talking about trees and plants and berries and flowers. Like literally there'll be like 3 or 4 pages about these plants that bud at a certain type of season, and then we'll have 1 page of dialogue, and it's like, we don't need all those pages. And like I mentioned before, there is a little bit of brutality when it comes to the morality. This does talk about relations between men and women a lot, and it does get a little bit dark. So if that's not something you're interested in, I wouldn't go into this book. I would put it in the conditions pile because of how long some of the pages are with the plants and because of the brutalness of some of the morality stuff that gets later on in the book. At number 20, I've got The Whistler. This was another audiobook that I read. I was at work and I needed to listen to something and I couldn't find anything on one of the apps that I listened to. And so I just went on what was available right away, and this is one of the first books that popped up. So I listened to it. This is my first John Grisham book I've ever read, and I will say it's not one of his most popular ones. It's a little bit down there. So I see why this book is considered very average, and I would agree with that. There's nothing super special about it. There's nothing very bad about it or very good about it. I was listening to it and it caught my attention here and there. It lost me here and there. This is the first like crime/lawyer drama I've ever read. So I will give his other books more of a chance, but this one definitely goes into the average pile for me. And at number 21, I've got End of Watch, which is the 3rd book in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy by Stephen King. I love Stephen King. I didn't read much of him this year, but I did read a lot of him last year. I read like It and some of the Dark Tower series. And this is the last one in his trilogy here. I really enjoyed the first one. The first one is amazing. The second one, just as enjoyable. But this 3rd one really jumps the shark when it comes to some of the fantastical elements. The first 2 was more of a realistic crime investigation, and it really loses itself here. Some of the stuff that he does in this book really just goes off the rails. Luckily, this series is not really about the concepts or ideas. It's really character heavy, and I enjoy a lot of the characters, especially Hodges, the main one. This one, obviously, is the 3rd one in the series, and it does jump the shark a little bit, so I'm gonna put it in the conditions pile down there with Clan of the Cave Bear and Will Smith. Last, but definitely not least, I've got Recursion by Blake Crouch here. I got this book from a local bookstore, a secondary bookstore I asked the clerk if they could recommend any science fiction books, and this is what they gave me. The initial premise of this is super interesting. This feels like a Christopher Nolan movie. There's a lot of things to do with time and space. I almost read the book in one sitting. That's how much I enjoyed it. But I will say near the end, it really starts to get highly repetitive with some of its ideas, and it starts relying heavily on its two main characters, which is the point of views that we switch back and forth from. And it becomes more of a love story at the end, and I really didn't like that because it gives up more of its initial ideas. The premise is what I really liked about it, and it definitely lets it go at the end. The first maybe half or 3/4, I'm not sure exactly where, is really good. I love the scientific ideas put in here, but the ending really was sour in my mouth, so I'm gonna put it in the average tier. And that's all I read this year. 36 books. Tell me what you think. Do you agree or disagree with any of my ideas or thoughts that I had about these books or the rankings? If you've got any books to recommend, put them in the comments down below, and thank you for watching.